Welcome back, readers, and thank you for joining us for another virtual story time. I have been doing this for way too long. And speaking of that, we will be ending our virtual story times at the end of May. It's time. But before that, we have lots of stories to read. So we're going to get started with today's story, Pollen. Darwin's 130-year prediction, written by Darcy Pattison and illustrated by Peter Willis. Let's get started. Sometimes science takes a long time. On January 25th, 1862, a box arrived at the home of the British scientist Charles Darwin. When Darwin opened it, he saw orchids, particularly this one, the star orchid from Madagascar. It's a kitty and a doggy. A star orchid from Madagascar surprised Darwin. It had a glossy, six-rayed flower like stars formed of snow-white wax. Its nectary measured 11.5 inches, 29.2 centimeters, long. A nectary is the place where flowers make nectar, the sweet liquid that insects and birds eat. Darwin realized the unusually long nectary was a scientific mystery. How was this flower pollinated? Pollination means that the flower's pollen is carried from one flower to another. When a flower is pollinated, it develops seeds which can grow new plants. For some flowers, the wind blows pollen from plant to plant. But for some flowers, insects pollinate the flowers. An insect flies to the flower to drink nectar. As the insect brushes against the flower, pollen sticks to the insect. When it moves to the next flower, the pollen brushes off the insect into the new flower. When Darwin studied the Madagascar star orchid, he wondered how an insect could drink its nectar. The nectary was too long and narrow for insects to crawl into. Scratch his beard. Darwin tried pushing bristles and needles into the nectary open, but couldn't pick up any pollen. Finally, he thought about how moths pollinated flowers. Moths use a proboscis, like a straw, to drink nectar. Darwin pushed a thin glass tube into the orchid's nectary. Pollen attached to the glass, and Darwin could pollinate another flower. Like a detective figuring out a mystery, Darwin made an amazing guess or prediction. The orchid with a long nectary grew somewhere on the island of Madagascar. He said that meant somewhere in Madagascar there must be a giant moth with an 11-inch long proboscis. He couldn't have one without the other. He responded, the moth and the orchid would depend on each other. The orchid would give nectar or food to the moth, and the moth would collect pollen to pollinate another orchid, so more orchids could grow. However, no one had seen such a moth. When Charles Darwin died in 1882, 20 years later, still no one had seen a giant moth with an 11-inch long proboscis. His thoughts. The moth would pollinate another orchid. No one has seen such a moth. You can't have one without the other. Madagascar. 21 years later, in 1903, two entomologists or insect scientists published a new book about moths. Baron Rothschild and Carl Jordan described a new Madagascar hawk moth. It had a very long proboscis that was coiled at the base of the moth's head until needed. When it needed to drink nectar, the moth unrolled the proboscis. But Darwin was wrong about one thing. The hawk moth was big, but not as big as he expected. Its wingspan measured about 5 or 6 inches from here to here. But the mystery wasn't totally solved. It seemed like the star orchid and hawk moth should go together, but no one had seen the hawk moth pollinate the star orchid until 1992. German entomologist Lutz Thilo Wasserthal, Ph.D., decided to try to photograph the elusive moth at the orchid. He set up a flight tent. He gathered star orchids from rocky slopes and placed them inside. The moths were nocturnal, only active at night. So Wasserthal set up night vision cameras and infrared illumination equipment that let him take night pictures. All they needed were moths. The hawk moths were rare. During the 6-week stay in Madagascar, Wasserthal was only lucky enough to catch 2. 2. With everything set up, Wasserthal released the 2 hawk moths into the flight cage. The air was filled with the aromatic, spicy scent from the flowers. The scientists waited. Then finally, a hawk moth appeared and hovered in front of the star orchid. To drink, the moth unfurled its proboscis and inserted it into the nectary. It grabbed hold of the flower and shoved the proboscis down to the nectar. When it came away, the moth had pollen on the proboscis to carry to the next flower. It only took about 6 seconds. Here's the reality about science. Sometimes progress can take years. Darwin made observations, tested his ideas, and made predictions. Later, Rothschild and Jordan cataloged new species of moths. They assumed they had found Darwin's moth, but they couldn't prove it. 130 years after Darwin's prediction, Wasserthal made the hard journey to Madagascar to prove them all right. Progress in science needs predictions, observations over a long period of time, and sometimes a bit of luck. And in the back of the book, you have information about the hawk moth and the orchid, and biographies on Charles Darwin and Wasserthal with a glossary, and the picture that was captured. Thank you for joining us for Pollen, Darwin's 130-year prediction. We hope to see you again very soon.